Welcome to this Our Burning Planet webinar, brought to you by APSA. I'm Tiara Walters. I'm a science writer for Our Burning Planet. And if you're a Maverick insider, a big welcome to you. It's an honor to walk this road with you. Today, we're talking about the ultimate recipe for disaster, how to make the perfect pandemic. It's been almost 2 years since COVID-19 transformed life as we know it. And yet, we're always stumbling over new mutations of theories on how this thing was made. Was it cooked up in a Chinese lab, killing 4 million people and unleashing global chaos? Or does science offer a more predictable answer, that pandemics like COVID are caused by over-consuming the natural world? Here to help us understand these issues are authorities in disease politics. Firstly, Karl Ammann, an expert on wildlife trafficking and time hero of the environment. Welcome to you, Karl. I have to say I'm delighted to catch you at home in Kenya between travels, which is no mean feat. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, yeah.
Also joining us is Professor Wolfgang Preiser. He's a working scientist, a SARS expert, and he also heads the virology unit at Stellenbosch University. Welcome to you, Wolfgang.
Thank you, Tiara. Good afternoon.
Just a quick note before we start. We do hope you'll sign up to our free newsletter, which brings you all the latest investigations from Our Burning Planet straight to your inbox by some of Africa's top global change reporters. Nicole will share the link in the chat window. And speaking of that chat window, today we are not talking about outlandish origin theories such as 5G. We are taking questions on the lab theory or on animal to human transmission, disease politics. Please post your questions and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Wolfgang, over to you. You actually led one of the first groups to isolate SARS back in 2003 to really understand the deep science. We don't yet have a conclusive theory on COVID's origins or evidence for that matter. But is there a weight of scientific opinion on this issue? And where would you say it's hovered over the past year or so? Would you say it's hovered towards zoonosis, that's animal to human transmission, or a lab theory pointing to either an intentional or accidental release?
Thank you. Very tricky question to start with. I think we all agree that the ultimate source of this virus is in the natural kingdom, in the animal kingdom, and we know that from actually since 2003, when the first SARS epidemic occurred, centered in Southeast China, and from there spreading, pretty much across the world, but overall causing a small number. I mean, in comparison to SARS-CoV-2, the second SARS coronavirus, a very small number of cases and deaths. It was a more dangerous virus. About 10% of those who became infected died, but it was also easier to bring under control. And then once everything kicked in, within half a year, we had actually gotten rid of it in the human population. So at the very beginning, there was a zoonotic transmission. That means animal to human transmission. And I was privileged to be a member of a WHO team sent to China in April 2003 to investigate to look at what was known at the time. A lot was actually not clear, and the world was grappling with this new virus and how to control the outbreak. And what we found is that in China, they had where it had started at the end of 2002. One big problem was the lack of communication, but on the other hand, a lot of work had been done, and that included not only identifying how that virus was being transmitted from person to person. So zoonosis stands at the right at the beginning, from animal to human, and that can happen repeatedly. But what makes a new infectious disease so dangerous is if it then jumps from person to person. If it is only a zoonosis, it's something you can easily control. But if it then acquires the ability to be propagated within the human body and then being passed on to other humans, this is what really makes it so dangerous. And that is what happened. And that, of course, is also where we are now with the new SARS coronavirus. And these early cases from late 2002 and early 2003 of the first SARS, they were largely or almost exclusively people to do with kitchens, with restaurants, working in animal markets, live animal markets, people who were chefs or people who were, slaughtering animals very fresh right in the kitchen to be prepared fresh. So there was like a smoking gun pointing to the origin. And then Chinese and other researchers went to these markets and they found the civet cat, which is not a cat, but a civet that is traded there and is farmed to some degree and traded and consumed to be the link between the origin of the virus and the human population. And a few years later, the origin, the natural reservoir of this particular virus was found in horseshoe bats, also in China. So here we have a transmission link starting with the bats that, as we now know, and we've done a lot of research on that for the past almost 20 years, and that includes our group here in Cape Town, other groups in Pretoria, so we know quite a lot about it also in Southern Africa, but around the world. We have found that coronaviruses occur in a huge variety in different species of bats. And most of those have no bearing on anything else. They do not seem to cause any harm to their natural hosts, and they don't seem to be transmitted to other animals, other species, including human beings. But a few of them have that ability, and that is what probably happened now. So in a way, we are not surprised. We, in retrospect, and that is, of course, always with hindsight, is the best side, the clearest side. Even in 2003, when human virologists, for the first time, really discovered that coronaviruses were something worth studying and working on. Prior to that, we'd been quite oblivious to them because we only knew them as agents of common cold, trivial common cold illness, not worth the concern and any further study. So we learned, we were wrong. We should have had them on our radar. We didn't have them prior to that. Ever since we've done a lot of work around the world from in different countries, identifying a huge variety of these viruses in different species of animals, including mostly bats. And we've also worked on identifying risk factors that would help them to jump across species and to cause severe disease. So, in a way, it fits perfectly well into the picture. And in between, since 2012, we've had another coronavirus from the same group that our SARS-CoV-2 belongs to, which is the MERS coronavirus, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. And here the link is also from a putative origin in bats via camels. Camels can be infected, camels can be ill with it, but they usually also survive. And then onto human beings. And again, we have, like with the first SARS virus, we have some chains of transmission from human to human patient. But again, it's quite a dangerous virus. Up to a third of those who become infected die. And transmission is quite easily interrupted and controlled. So it hasn't taken off to become a pandemic. And sadly, the third one in the row, which is the one we are dealing with now, had the perfect combination of not being such a deadly virus after all, only causing serious illness and death in a relatively small proportion of those infected, but being very easy to be transmitted, very difficult to control because you can be infected without knowing it. You can be infectious before you develop illness. So it has the perfect combination of properties to allow it to take off. So to be honest, I don't suspect foul play in this. I see a lot of human negligence, a lot of lessons that should have been learned previously, that should have seen us much better prepared, hopefully even not allowing this to take off. But what I don't see is the smoking gun that there is any bad, manipulation behind it. but
Okay.
maybe we can discuss that a bit further later.
Okay. Karl, over to you. You've done your 10,000 hours, certainly, times many more, in the dirtiest trenches of wildlife trade in both Africa and Asia as an undercover investigator and journalist. And you've also spent much time warning about the abuses of CITES, that's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. What do you make of the way China handled the pandemic's early stages? And do you think that the WHO has been soft on China, perhaps in the way China often seems to get a free pass from corrupt CITES officials to traffic African wildlife? I mean, much of CITES is still based on paper permits, which is kind of bizarre.
Yeah, I'm not the virologist like Wolfgang, but as I said, I've done a lot of work on the ground as far as the wildlife trade in Africa and in Asia. And yes, whenever I go into the field and come across scenarios which disturb me, and I find out that the CITES, the convention which is meant to control the illegal cross-border trade or even the legal cross-border trade, there are huge loopholes, and there's lots of people exploiting these loopholes. And the world still, the average person who is interested and concerned, know this convention exists, believes that all these experts meeting very regularly in nice locations somewhere and talking for hours know what they're doing, and therefore the trade is reasonably under control or is not a big issue. And that's where I have a real problem, because what I see is, the theoretical part discussed at these conventions and what happens in praxis, where in some countries, quite frankly, one has reached a stage where the CITES convention essentially drives the illegal wildlife trade because it's so easy to make money out of it and being corrupt in the process. There are lots of officials which make 10 times more from issuing illegal and fake permits than they make from their salary, their monthly salary. So they want this trade to continue, and it does not necessarily include bats all the time, or it doesn't include bats in general, as far as I've seen going across the international border. They eat them domestically. But as I said, we have, for example, the apes. The ape trade is pretty pronounced in terms of orphans which go into private collections in the Middle East. China is building hundreds of zoos, new zoos and safari parks. They all want chimps, gorillas, even bonobos and orangutans and so on. A lot of these are wild caught, illegally exported under CITES. And the virologists tell me that besides the SIV, the simian virus strain, which caused HIV, there's another 4 or 5 of similar strains out there which haven't crossed the species barrier yet, but potentially can and could lead to a worse epidemic than HIV was and is. So that's all out there, and I've spent some time on that. I have been asked to bring back test samples with a drop of blood from orphan chimps I found in places like Central African Republic, the Congo, Gabon, and so on, and they went to labs overseas and have been analyzed. So yes, the interest has been there. And then the Ebola was another component which cropped up in the context of Africa. Again, most, Ebola seems to be bat source or bat related to start off with, but chimps, gorillas, and bonobos die, or lesser primates as well. And on 2 cases, I've been involved in meeting pygmies, Baka, tribal people, where a large percentage of a village died because they had found dead chimps and gorillas in the forest and had eaten them. And I documented some of that. I dragged some of the survivors to the Pasteur Institute to see if one could prove with antibody that indeed they had been infected by Ebola and so on. So yes, if one is out there, one sees this regularly, and one knows these species still cross international barriers and represent a risk each time it happens, that it often happens illegally. and there still doesn't seem to be real political will to clamp down on that. I mean, I don't see any enforcement happening. With any other contraband products, be it weapon, be it human trafficking, be it drugs or whatever, the enforcement is much more severe. The people involved in this trafficking and trade have to worry about consequences and, things happening to them. While in the wildlife trade, they can largely laugh it off. Nothing will really happen at the end of the day. They know it. It's a high return, low risk scenario. So yes, I find it pretty disturbing even at this stage, 1.5 years after the start of this epidemic. I haven't been in the field, I must admit, but from what I hear from my local investigators, not really much has changed at all on the ground, be it in Africa or in Asia.
I think our audience would be very interested to know, Karl, what your experience in this field is. And you do have this valuable paradigm of experience on pandemics stretching over decades. So take HIV/AIDS, which first emerged in the early 80s, round about there. And around that time, Karl's images almost single-handedly exposed the trade in bushmeat, especially great apes, which was then linked to HIV/AIDS. And Wolfgang, you've also worked on HIV/AIDS as a working scientist. As I understand it, this is the general consensus that it was the trade in primates, in the consumption of primate meat, that ultimately led to this spillover that created HIV.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I think one has to keep in mind that the phenomenon of infectious agents passing over from animals to humans or in between animals also is not new, of course. So a number of those agents that are deeply and firmly ours, that we deal with in a diagnostic lab on a daily basis, actually have their origins often centuries or even millennia ago in animals. And a big time, a lot of these influxes happened around the time when we started domesticating animals. In fact, rinderpest, the canine, the dog distemper, and measles virus are very closely related. And one has, of course, there is no archaeology on viruses because viruses don't fossilize, unfortunately, so we can't dig them up. So we have to use other forms of evidence to try and reconstruct what happened in the past. But there's very strong indications that one gave rise to the other because humans, dogs, and cows and cattle, started living closely together. And that is also true for a number of other pathogens. So it's not a new phenomenon. There was a big influx. Then, of course, at the same time with agriculture and animal husbandry having been invented, human populations increased, people settled down, the population numbers, the density of settlements increased, and that also gave these pathogens then the opportunity to cross from human to human, as they wouldn't have been able to do when it was just small gangs of people, moving across the landscape. So it's not something new. The problem is that the pace at which this is happening is just accelerated so immensely with a huge human population and the ever increasing intrusion into natural habitats and the exploitation of natural resources, that it's basically spinning out of control. So, for example, I like the example of Ebola being transmitted from its original reservoir host, which is likely also bats, to, let's say, apes. These apes being found dead or dying in the forest and being consumed by local people, and thereby then the villages, getting Ebola. I mean, we think that must have happened for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. But in former times, it basically meant the village died, that all inhabitants died, and the few survivors were immune. And that is it. And the same would have happened with these retroviruses, with HIV and its relatives, of which there's also a variety, the simian immunodeficiency viruses in different types of monkeys and apes. So it would have been a localized issue. It didn't have the chance, as it does now, of very rapidly getting into the next bigger village, then to maybe a hospital, a rural hospital in some place, being amplified by, for example, unsafe reuse of unsterile medical equipment like syringes. If you have one syringe, and that was the first Ebola outbreak in the 70s in Zaire at the time, where it was people being treated in a hospital and everybody sharing the same syringe, literally, for malaria treatment. That basically led to everyone becoming infected. So our own activities massively amplify the opportunity for these pathogens to then take hold in the human population and to cross. And that is why we now know HIV originated. And of course, it's not the last one. It's one that was presented with a chance of establishing itself in the human population, and it used that chance. Many others would have failed, either because the chance wasn't there, because it was in a local, in a small, very remote rural area, and there wasn't chance of transmission, or because it was controlled better than we then managed with HIV. So it's only a fraction of what's happening all the time that is leading to these outbreaks. But we cannot claim it's unexpected. We have seen it before. We have quite well worked out the risk factors. And what I find stunning is that we are, still in a position where we just wait for the next one to hit us, rather than taking a more proactive approach and saying, listen, there are certain risky activities that would have been fine in the past with small populations of humans, a lot of nature untouched. If you want to, if you have to take a risk because it's your livelihood and you go out and hunt and live from the landscape, then do that. And if you're unlucky, it'll affect you and maybe your family and your close group, and it won't spill beyond. We are no longer in that position. We now are in a globalized world, and anything that gets transmitted into a human being can within 48 hours be across the globe. And that's what we are seeing now. And somehow our tools to prevent this, or to mitigate it at least, have not kept pace. So we are being outwitted by the virus, as we've seen now so vividly and dramatically with COVID.
Wolfgang, that's a very powerful way to explain this history of disease politics, and certainly to look at the natural origins of pandemics. But we've had some questions come through about the lab theory. And Robin Lee is asking, do you completely dismiss the escape from a lab theory? Why is China blocking a second investigation? I guess Wolfgang, that's probably a question for you.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very good question. I don't think anybody can completely dismiss the lab theory. However, we don't have any evidence that it would have originated. And the lab we are talking about is probably the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that big high security lab that has actually, incidentally, as I believe, been working on, amongst others, coronaviruses in bats. So this is, it seems like, oh wow, there's a connection there. Closer analysis, and there's been a scientific paper out a few weeks ago looking at these very early cases of COVID in human beings and where they were linked, where the people worked and where people lived, actually does not cluster around that lab. It doesn't seem to lead to that lab. It rather leads to these wild animal and live animal markets and so on. But of course, the theory that maybe they were working on such an agent in a laboratory and a laboratory accident happened, somebody became infected and then spread the infection outside, I don't think we can rule it out 100%. I think there is a, to rule out, the absence of proof is not proof of absence. So, I cannot prove it did not happen. I think it is it is quite unlikely compared to the scale of potential transmission opportunities that happened outside. Whether they actually did happen in Wuhan, or whether, for example, one of the traders or tradesmen traveled to one of the areas in China, which is 1,500 or so kilometers away, where people do catch bats in caves, and where the closest animal relative of our SARS-CoV-2 was found. That is another question. And I fully agree. It is highly unsatisfactory that China is not opening up the cards. And I have to say that in 2003, the scenario was not dissimilar. It was a situation where the world started to distrust the information coming from China. China claiming that the outbreak had been controlled, which originated in Guangdong, which is in the southeast of the country, while in the meantime it had spread clearly to Beijing, to the capital, and to other parts of China, and at the same time also throughout the world, via Hong Kong, and then to Singapore, to Canada, to the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. And it turned out that actually China was doing, or Chinese scientists and public health officials were doing a fine job. So there was actually no reason to hide, because they had done everything necessary, and it really helped to come to grips with this outbreak. And I just find it very regrettable that this time around there is again such a secrecy and this cloak of misinformation or lack of information. I also think that the very belated WHO mission that went to China a year or so after the outbreak actually started, which is a long time. These animals are long dead and removed, and so it's a long time. It's a pity that this didn't happen in a more transparent and more forthcoming way. It's also a pity if one hears that information was not freely shared, not made available, citing confidentiality issues, which is quite silly. Let's face it, about the early cases, surely one can block out identifying characteristics and speak to people via video links. It must be possible to do this. So it seems like phony excuses, not allowing a full and transparent investigation. Whether that actually points to some sinister origin or not, I doubt it, but it's clearly not helping at all, and I think it's a big problem, and I feel very discouraged to see that almost 20 years on after SARS, after which the international health regulations were renovated and modernized, and we hoped would be we thought would now be up to the task. That again we've run into a situation where it's very much blaming one another and not being fully transparent. It's a pity because all of this hinders real progress.
Karl, you've certainly grappled a lot with China when it comes to extracting data and information to aid your work as a wildlife investigator. So I guess my question to you is, if Beijing has nothing to hide, why don't they just share some of that critical raw data they've been hanging on to and that everyone's been asking for?
Look, my assessment would be that China probably has something to hide. I have been working on 2 documentaries now, one about tiger farming, which is kind of a subject which is partially underground as well. Also, there are official tiger farms, but it's a topic the Chinese do not want to see discussed in the public domain if they can avoid it. There's also the trading in live elephants I've been working on a film. So there's a lot of that going on. And this farming of animals, I've seen a lot of these cane rat farms. I've seen porcupine farms. And there's other species being farmed, even the civet cats, which we talked about, which were potentially responsible for SARS in the first place, are still being farmed. And the general story or background is that, the immunity level of farmed animals, or the distress of being farmed in settings which are not ideal, creates more potential risk for pathogen to pass among the animals and then of course to the humans. Now we know that, and China has now closed a lot of these farms down. But again, based on my local investigators, if you go to a restaurant which is known to serve wildlife products, you ask for pangolin, you ask for cane rat, they might not have it on the menu right here and right now, but if you order it for dinner tonight, it will be there and it will be served to you. That includes pretty much all the species which we have been mentioning. It all happens under the table, no longer on the table. I still have menus which have pictures of all these species, including tiger. I mean, I have menus where tiger minced meat and tiger stew and the ragu is officially on the menu. That's all still going on. It's now just happening under the table, and that's kind of a phenomena I have found in China all over with these issues. And yes, in a communist system, the feeling is there's more control over the individuals, over the society in general. If they really wanted to control it with this face recognition and all these ways they control their people, they should have better means. And if there was more political will, there could be more control.
Okay. Wolfgang, you wanted to say something. Please go ahead.
I would like to lest we be accused of China bashing. That is, often the argument that, we are sort of, and I would really want to make the point that there are enormous deficiencies and surely, there are big problems, but we should by no means think that we are the better people and doing well. An example, again, in 2003, I believe it was that monkeypox, which is misnamed in that it is actually does not come from monkeys. It comes probably from rodents, arrived in the United States and and infected dozens of civilians. I mean, of normal people who did nothing but purchase as pets for their kids prairie dogs. These prairie dogs had been kept in captivity in dealerships together with African rodents. The giant rat, I think, is the name. So two animal species that are continents apart, that would never ever before met one another, were now kept together. And as Karl pointed out, the conditions in such units are often very bad. So animals are stressed, they are malnourished, hygiene may be deficient. So perfect conditions for infectious agents to spread. And what nobody had known before, prairie dogs were susceptible to monkeypox. And they were then sold to the unsuspecting public and led to cases. Luckily, nobody came to great harm. It was all localized infections and was sort of, brought under control quite rapidly. That is totally unnecessary. I mean, there is no, other than making money, there is no reason for catching, animals in the wild in Africa, shipping them across the Atlantic, and then keeping the survivors together with totally unrelated species for prolonged periods of time and selling them off as pets. I mean, you only do this for money. There is no, this is not even for food or anything. So these things happen. And of course, another area where all countries, I suppose, really are creating still enormous issues is antibiotic resistance through animal husbandry and bad practices. So, I mean, we are not pointing fingers on one country, but I think one has to be very critical that these things are happening. And of course, ultimately, we as the consumer demanding cheap meat, always available, and cheap eggs and so on, we are favoring these conditions. This is only possible if there is mass husbandry, which brings with it hygienic issues and which is then brought under control. And animals are also fattened more quickly by the abuse and misuse of antibiotics. So it's definitely not China bashing. I think humanity is engaging in a number of activities that we know are risky, and I just fail to understand why one cannot say, listen, guys, this was a the biggest warning we could have wanted. Can we please mend our ways and improve? And I think this is also behind Karl's frustration with Chinese measures. I mean, surely the villager in a remote Congolese village that goes about and hunts their cane rats or porcupines or whatever they need to eat, let them do that. But as soon as this now becomes a commodity and gets traded, then it's also when species conservation issues come in. It's not the local consumption by small population. It's really when this is a trade that goes out and leads to the emptying of the forests. And this is also where the infectious disease risks start. So this is what we need to stop.
Yeah. Karl, in your work over decades, you will certainly have dealt with these issues, as you have explained quite clearly already. And I think it would be fairly safe to say that this pandemic could have actually started anywhere in the world. Would you say that's a correct appraisal of the situation?
I'm not sure if that can be concluded. I mean, based on what Wolfgang explained with monkeypox, yes, that is, the way it could happen. But the fact that it has happened several times in certain regions of the world, and I mean, yes, when we're talking China, I have observed on the Vietnamese side almost more extreme the eating of wildlife and wildlife restaurants with all kinds of species, including cobra blood drinking and all that stuff going on. Indonesia as well, the python skins which end up as our handbags in the Western luxury world. The meat is eaten in and served in Indonesia and other places. So, and of course in Africa, we know the bush meat is consumed by the local communities and has been for centuries and thousands of years. What has changed there and is the fact that we have opened up these forests, and as Wolfgang said, this was used to be localized. The village might be completely disappearing after an outbreak of Ebola. Nowadays they jump on a logging lorry and they drive to a clinic somewhere where they encounter other people and where the spreading happens. And this opening up of these forests is done mostly by Western outfits. Nowadays, again, Asian outfits have bought up a lot of the European logging companies. But if you go to Gabon, Congo, and so on, there's still a lot of Western outfits logging these forests, bringing in a lot more people into these forests, a lot more of them start hunting because it's easy. There's still a lot of wildlife around to be hunted. And but the end result is the empty forest syndrome. You do that for 10 years and then you have to move on as a hunter because there's nothing left to be hunted in this forest. So this development is relatively recent, I would say 20, 30 years, this opening up of these forests, and it's a major contributing factor to bringing bushmeat from the bush to the towns, and with it, obviously, the potential risk of these virus transmissions.
Certainly, China has been at the receiving end of an immense amount of criticism over the past year or so, and in many cases, deservedly so. But Wolfgang, what most debates seem to miss on this particular issue is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the institute that traced the 2003 SARS outbreak to a bat cave in China. It took hard work over many years. They even warned a new outbreak was possible, and that was in 2017, just 2 years before COVID, in Nature, the world's most prestigious academic journal. I mean, they are one of the world's top virology institutes. Why would they be the ones to unleash a killer virus on the world?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think all that I know, I've never collaborated with anyone from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but I obviously know them as colleagues in the field and doing eminent work right there where things are in nature out there. And this is exactly what I say. I mean, we have in the lab, if we do it properly, there are very clear guidelines on how to work safely. And of course, accidents do happen, but accidents are, if the lab is well run, and I'm sure they are well run, accidents are recognized and then dealt with appropriately. So the risk that something would have happened there and been allowed to escape, I think it's extremely remote. So I fully agree. I think this is not what would have helped, of course, and that is not the problem of the Institute. I think this is a larger political issue. And of course, the whole field has now become thoroughly poisoned by politicizing from all sides. I mean, everybody is, many people are trying to build their little empires and their re-elections on that field, which doesn't help. It would have been nice to keep politics out of it and just come to the facts. But it has now become mired in this controversy and the wider Western Chinese clash of cultures and fight for influence and so on, which is very regrettable because ultimately, and that is why, and of course I'm biased. I'm a virologist. We also try and discover new viruses and characterize new viruses that we find in wildlife. So I have a clear position in this. But, of course, good regulation of potentially risky laboratory work is important. But already we are losing perspective. And may I tell you that when the Beta variant, at the time not yet called like that, emerged in South Africa at the end of 2020, which effectively shut us out of the rest of the world for since then, because we are now the variant area. We detected it early on through our research. We were able to isolate the virus in cell culture, and this was very important to pursue further research on it. So it's not a question of not doing this, because of course somebody can become infected. Chances are, however, that your infection risk from going shopping or from meeting friends or from whatever else is much higher, of course, than the lab risk. And the lab risk is something which we can control if we have a well-run lab. But what happened is that of 3 overseas institutions that asked us for our isolate to work, to do scientific studies on that, only 1 received it, and only just this week. And it took 6 months to get through various layers of red tape on either side. The other 2 have long given up, because for them it was quicker to wait until a patient infected with the Beta variant came to their shores and isolate the virus themselves. And I mean, basically, this is not the way of advancing. If we block legitimate, good, useful work by exaggerated regulations hindering progress there, whilst not looking at where the real issues are, we are not doing anybody a favor. And I feel that this emphasis on the lab origin, is actually risky, because we are now losing sight of the real issue. And the real issue is the exploitation at large scale of nature, uncontrolled, far distance trade. And once such a pathogen has jumped into the human population, of still inadequate precautions. I mean, many countries, not just China, probably China least, but many developed countries found themselves without sufficient masks and, all the other things that we knew we would need at some stage, and yet they weren't there. So, there are many failures on many accounts, and let's not just set up a smoke screen now investigating only that lab origin theory, because for me, the real issues are different, and it's uncomfortable truth hiding there.
It certainly is. We have so many questions coming through, and I think that we're only going to be able to get through a couple of them. But I think, Wolfgang, if I might just press you there a little bit on the science, the so-called science behind the lab hypothesis. It's said that this virus was perfectly designed to infect human beings, what would you say to people who raise that particular concern?
So that basically means that somebody made it.
Yes.
And this is possible, but as colleagues have pointed out, it would take an immense effort and surely a whole army of highly qualified scientists working for years to start such a virus from scratch. What we would do if we were, without a conscience and had been captured by bad forces, being paid vast sums of money, throwing all our decency overboard, we would start with something that we know exists out there, and we would tamper with certain aspects of it. And this is simply not what this virus is. This virus is a new virus. It is closely related to a bat virus. So why would I go out and look for a bat virus and then try and make that infect human beings? It's just far-fetched. It's not the way that you would go about these experiments. And, in order to get there, you would have had so many failed attempts. It simply, again, you cannot rule it out with 100% certainty, but it makes no sense whatsoever. It would have to have been done by people who are extremely highly qualified and skilled, and such people wouldn't have chosen the approach that would have led to what we are seeing. So no, it's simply that doesn't cut it for me.
Okay. Karl, I have a question for you from Bonnie Hillary, and she asks, is there a danger of chimpanzees or gorillas being adversely infected with COVID from human transmission?
I believe there is. We have 2 chimpanzees which live with us since 30 years. They have big outdoor enclosures. And I do believe the female had COVID. I had it, and I believe she had it. She got very sick. We x-rayed her lungs and so on, and it all looked very suspicious. But we didn't go through the process of doing testing and so on. She recovered. But I'm convinced, yes, it can happen to certainly chimps and gorillas, obviously our closest animal relatives. But then we know it has also happened to species at the New York, the New York Zoo. I think it was tigers which were infected. So yes, other species can be infected with this COVID-19 virus.
And how are your chimpanzees doing now, Karl?
They're fine. I just spent some time with them and played with them. Everything is perfect at the moment.
Okay. We have a question from Angel Kamalo, and she says that she is enjoying the talk, and she recently got to hear about the Global One Health initiative. Wolfgang, I know that there's been quite a bit of talk about this recently as a holistic way to approach a pandemic response. Can you briefly talk us through what that involves and what your views on the Global One Health approach are?
Yeah, with pleasure. No, it's actually a concept that fundamentally is based on the recognition that we are inextricably linked, we as a human species, with animal species and the wider environment. So there's basically this triangle, and there are sort of nice logos and depictions of the 3 spheres interacting with one another. Each of them has their own health issues, maybe it be infectious diseases or others, and whatever happens to one of them has implications for the others. And of course, these links between these 3 different spheres are something over which we as humanity have a lot of control. Whether we exercise that control or whether we sort of do it involuntarily and create problems is a different question. But there is lots of links between those spheres. So this is a concept which is increasingly recognized that, and of course for veterinarians, it's sort of been a long-standing story. So you inspect slaughterhouses and abattoirs in order to prevent the consumption of unsafe meat. So you look at animal health, and that's a very simple and long-standing issue. look at animal health, and if the animal has died from anthrax or something else like that, you would not allow it to be traded. But of course, it becomes far more intricate if you look particularly at the link between environmental health and animal health. And environmental health in ours. And it's not limited to infectious diseases, but I think infectious diseases are one prime example of how the spheres are connected and how what we do to one has implications to the other. Another example, sticking with infectious diseases, is for example, agricultural schemes that lead to irrigation, which breeds mosquitoes, which leads to an increase in mosquito-transmitted infections if wrongly done, or may favor the breeding of snails that then lead to a surge in schistosomiasis or the occurrence of schistosomiasis in the population. So, there are many things that we do which, one needs to know how these things interplay with one another in order to make the right decisions. And going down one way and not looking at what that does, creates problems. So it's a more holistic approach. In practice, it's of course difficult because it's different agencies in a country, it's different ministries and government departments looking at these different spheres, and getting them to talk to one another is very difficult.
Okay. Well, I think it's safe to say that humanity literally cannot afford another pandemic. COVID-19 is predicted to, I think, cost trillions over the next few years. So I guess in our closing minutes, and this also feeds into several of the questions we've received, I have the same question to each of our panelists. Millions of people survive on wildlife by eating it, selling it, or both. Is it practical to ban wildlife trade? And if not, how do we stop the next pandemic? Karl, over to you, please.
Look, as I said, if you talk Africa and if you talk the person who goes out bushmeat hunting with a few snares, I'm looking out on the Mount Kenya forest here. We have snares in this forest. There are people here who are at, the survival's edge. And they have done this all the time. They will keep doing it. There's no way we're going to change the world in that context. We have benefited, lived off nature as a species for a very long time, and we'll keep doing so. But the farming component of these species in large quantities for a specialty market for status and status symbols and so on is a new phenomena. And I think there we should differentiate, where our sources are and how far we are ready to go with animal farming and so on. So I don't think things will change. I think we will hopefully have learned a few things from this epidemic, especially with vaccine productions and so on. But I think we will have another one coming down the line. And as I said, I don't see things changing either out here or in Southeast Asia, or as you said, maybe even in Germany or the US with certain practices which represent risks, which we are not really addressing at this point.
Mm-hmm. Right, but I think hope is a critical currency at this stage, and to give people some hope. What is that hope? And does CITES offer some answers in terms of potentially overhauling that organization's framework?
Look, I mean, they're talking now about bringing in this aspect of health and cross-species transmission, zoonosis and so on, as a component of CITES. Up to now, that wasn't even part of the agenda. I mean, an animal could be traded and had a health certificate supposedly at one end and arrived in a quarantine at the other end, and that was about it. But beyond that, there was no CITES specific rules and regulations dealing with risk factors. To me, it's as I said, it's CITES is one of the biggest issues I've been dealing with now for decades, in a sense that the problems constantly arise, not just with, disease transmission, but with actually wiping species out in the wild, because the demand is there for them, and therefore where there is a demand there will be a supply, and that's what's happening. And the control in context of CITES is not there, and in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, it actually encourages the trade. So yes, I'm an extremely frustrated person. It's a convention which should be looked at again, decided, is it salvageable? Does the world still accept that there should be controls? They all talk about their own rights to determine what they eat, what they farm, what they, trade and so on. Who are we to tell the rest of the world they can't do this, that, or the other thing? Is it too late to get such a convention accepted by the rest of humanity? So yes, again, unfortunately, I don't see much hope on that front either.
Wolfgang, given that lab accidents do happen, do we need to take into consideration the tightening of regulations to stop the next pandemic? I guess that's the first part of my question to you. It's about lab accidents. And then finally, what are your overall thoughts on preventing another, I guess, black swan event, such as the one that we've dealt with over the past year or so?
Great. Yeah, as I said, I'm somewhat biased when it comes to labs. I think that our lab is tightly run, and I feel absolutely confident that this doesn't pose a risk to the staff or the students or the population at large. One cannot be 100% fail-proof at all times. I mean, that is a given, and I think we need to strike a balance. I do believe that the current regulatory framework is good if it is applied in a consistent way. And I think there is of course always a risk of people not following the rules. I must, however, also say that one must not over-regulate, and I think that the issues are not that different from what Karl mentioned regarding CITES. You may, and CITES actually is doing that for us at this stage as we are talking. We are trying to import a special saline from America, which has also been held up for more than 3 months. And you know what's outstanding? CITES approval. You know why it falls under CITES? Because in 1960s, a monkey was sacrificed somewhere in America to start this saline in the 1960s. And because that monkey falls under CITES, that species, everything that comes from it is basically treated as if it was rhino horn or it was tiger bone, and that of course makes no sense whatsoever. It's a cell line, it's a laboratory thing, and nobody had to die for this in the past 40 years. So one has to be very careful to get regulations right. And just senselessly heaping further regulatory layers onto things will only serve to make the legitimate players' lives difficult, as it is already happening to some degree. But the rogue elements will still do what they want, of course. And we see that with wildlife trade and others. If there is a will, there is a way, and if you're unscrupulous enough, you will get past it. So I think it needs to be a fine balance. Surely we need to update regulations to keep pace, but at the same time, the laboratories that I know and with whom we collaborate, I vouch for, are doing things perfectly well.
Fantastic. And then I think you have about 30 seconds to wrap up, just your overall thoughts on how we can prevent the next disaster.
With pleasure. There will be further pandemics. I think it's a fact of life. It's no getting away from it. It's a question of reducing the risk of sort of spreading it out more, of not falling for each and every one, by reducing the opportunities for new pathogens, and then for being prepared. And I think we should have learned good lessons during COVID, and we will see whether this is kept up in the years to come. This is not going to be the last one. I fully agree with Karl. We will see more of them. They may be worse than the current one. They may be not so bad. We don't know, but they will happen, and we better be prepared. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Well, time has run out, and having spent hard, lonely lockdown hours reporting on this issue, I have to say it's something that's very close to our heart here at Our Burning Planet. It's also close to the heart of Professor Wolfgang Preiser, as you've heard. Wolfgang has lived the COVID story more than most. Wolfgang, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And then to Karl. Karl, it's truly wonderful to see you. If anyone has lived this story for decades, it's you, and it's been a deep honor to have you on board.
Glad for you to have me and add my voice to it.
And to you at home, in a coffee shop, or at the office, find out more on Karl's film, Tiger Mafia, by going to www.thetigermafia.co. That's www.thetigermafia.co. And of course, you can sign up to the finest global change newsletter on the side of the Milky Way. That's the Our Burning Planet newsletter. Every 2 weeks, beaming to your inbox, mahala. I'm sure that Nicole has shared that link in the chat window. For now, thanks to APSA for supporting this webinar and enabling our work. And thanks, as ever, to our Maverick Insiders for helping us defend truth. Goodbye.